So first of all, I want to say thank you to Vaughan Gething for being with us today. The interesting thing for me is I'm very rarely in a meeting where there's another Vaughan. So when anybody says Vaughan, I know they always mean me, so it might be a little bit more confusing today. So it's nice to see somebody who shares my name. So Minister, you are very welcome. Vaughan Gething was born in Zambia, but has strong roots in Wales. He describes his father as a white Welsh economic migrant who came from Ogbo by the sea and was working as a vet in Zambia when he married Vaughan's mother. And when Vaughan was only 2 years old, the family moved to Wales for a short time until his father found work in Dorset, which is where Vaughan spent most of his childhood. As a student, he came back to Wales to study law, first in Aberystwyth and then in the University of Cardiff Law School. And he became president of the University Guild of Students and the first black president of the National Union of Students Wales. After qualifying as a solicitor, he specialised in employment law. At the age of 34, he became the youngest ever president of Wales TUC. And he joined the Labour Party when he was 17 and for some time served as a member of Cardiff City Council. In 2011, he was elected as the Welsh Assembly member for Penarth and Cardiff South. And in 2016, he became Cabinet Secretary for Health, Wellbeing and Sport, where he had, of course, a very high profile amongst the people of Wales because he was the minister of that department during lockdown and during COVID, which must have been a very challenging and taxing time. And later he became Minister for Health and Social Services as well. And since May this year, he has been the Minister for the Economy, which I've got no doubt is going to be another challenging post as we come out of lockdown. So you seem to be moving from one challenging role to another. So you are very, very welcome. And I hand the floor to you now for you to address us. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you for running through the slightly shorter version of my CV. But no, it's interesting because I just want to talk a little bit today before I open up the questions about how we see ourselves, and I don't just mean black people, but how we see ourselves in Wales, and how do we see our past, and even then more importantly, how do we see our future? And you know, you're right, and you've read out the list of things that I've done in a shortened form, and there's quite a lot of firsts in there. And I've regularly said this, my ambition is to go through life and not be the first person that looks like me to do things. But there may well be more things where I still get to be the first, but at some point in time, it should no longer be something that people comment on. And it's just, when do we get to the point where we really are so at ease with ourselves and who we are, that we acknowledge and celebrate difference rather than saying it's unusual to have someone who looks like you occupying this position. I think about some of the context of where we are now. So it's Black History Month. We're changing the curriculum in Wales. I'm very proud that we are, to make sure that Black histories are part of the history of Wales, and that's going to be taught not just in areas of the country like the one that I represent, where there is a greater amount of visible diversity, but actually as part of the history of Wales in all of its forms as well. And I'll go on a bit more about that, but of course the immediate context of the pandemic, of our changed relationship with Europe, of what does recovery after the pandemic look like, and an opportunity to remake Wales in many ways, and to also to think a bit more about the progress that we've already made, but to acknowledge the continued challenges that we have. So every now and again, I think, and I come back to this challenge of who are we and do we belong? Because actually those are questions that sometimes people like me ask ourselves, but they're also questions that are asked of us on a regular basis as well. And think back to Enoch Powell, who was a prominent conservative politician through most of his life. He then joined the Ulster Unionists in his later career, but a prominent figure in UK politics. He made an infamous speech about the rivers of blood, and he was basically making a very clear argument that Britain should be a white country, and the people that look like me should be encouraged to go back to where we really belong, to where we came from. And that came in sort of encouraging people to go home, as it was seen. And in some cases, obviously, that turned into a very different way of looking at things, where people should be forced to go because we don't belong. And that was a very clear element to it. It's interesting. I read a speech that Powell gave where he was talking about Britain and England interchangeably, and he's talking about the English and the ability to rediscover who England is if the Windrush Range wave of migration was turned back. And he was basically talking about going back to Tudor times, when he viewed that's who the English really were and are. And yet, of course, that takes a particular view of history that isn't really borne out by the facts. I had a look at a book, I forget the author now, and one of the opening lines is there were Africans in Britain before there were English. Because, of course, the English were Germanic peoples who invaded, the Anglo-Saxons and the Jutes primarily, but good few Scandinavians thrown in there as well. And yet when the Romans were here, a generally multicultural empire, there were black soldiers, black servants, black slaves, many of whom stayed. So you'll find people with African genes in their bloodlines who won't realise quite how far back that goes. And the difficulty is, if you're always fighting the past and fighting for your entitlement to be seen as belonging here, then that's a really big distraction. It can be really wearing and tiring, constantly having to say, I belong and this is my country too. And that means you don't get on and think about, what can I do with my business? How do I get on in my job? Where do I want to go and study in university? Where's the best place for me to go to achieve my ambitions, to use the talent I have? If you're constantly having to think in your own mind or to make out loud arguments about, well, of course I'm Welsh, I belong here. You know, Wales isn't a white Celtic nation, and everyone who doesn't fit that time frame doesn't belong. And interesting in that, when I was in university, I went to Aberystwyth, and there was lots of people who bought into this idea that Wales is the last great bastion of the Celtic nation. And yet, of course, there are a number of people in Wales who have red hair, who are seen as being, you know, that's the Celtic. And yet for a number of them, it won't be. And I had a friend of mine who won a National Eisteddfod chair for poetry, actually, Tudur, lovely man. And he's saying that his red hair had nothing to do with the Celts. He looked back in his family history, and it's because there were people in his family who came from Northern England, and his red hair was actually Scandinavian gene pool, not Celtic. And so there's something about how you see yourself and how you see a version of history that you see as being self-fulfilling, and it can reinforce your place, or it can also, if it's told in that sort of power-like way, it can be used as a way to try to say you aren't really one of us and you don't belong. And it's not just people like Powell, it's been in a range of areas, of course, as well. You think about the trade union I've been part of has often been on the right side of things, but not always. There were dockers who marched in favour of Enoch Powell and the views he had. And when you go through the more recent history of the 80s, the 90s and the 2000s, well, you look at the trade union movement that I was and still am proud to be part of. And at various points in its life, the trade union has been very male and very white, and not recognise all of the people that it was there to represent, and not actually stood up for the people that it could and should have done in the way that today, I think modern leaders of trade unions would say that isn't who we should be, and we shouldn't try to gloss over our own past. And that's the other part of this, is that I think that in many respects, there are some people who say you have to choose. You have to choose between saying the past was wrong, let it go, or the past was complicated and we should learn from it. And I think that is partly how we see ourselves in Wales, because there's this idea sometimes that Wales has either been a progressive and open society and country that has always been on the right side of these things. You talk about the Welsh abolitionists, the people who helped to form part of the railroad that fought against slavery in North America. You can see that in the way that people celebrate Paul Robeson and his affinity with working people in Wales at a time when he was being persecuted in America and prevented from leaving. That is absolutely part of our history and part of our story as a nation, but equally so are the race riots of more than a century ago, where people were being pursued because black people had formed relationships and were having children, and where black people were forcibly and violently ejected from just a few yards away from where I live. And going back to that point about the fact there have been black people on these islands for, you know, the best part of 2 millennia, it wasn't, you know, black people didn't arrive here when the Windrush arrived. but the pace has accelerated and it's much more visible. And yet actually in areas with an active docks, Cardiff in particular in Wales, there's been a stable black community here for some time. And that stable black community hasn't always been treated well. And that's part of our story too as well. And I think this also comes back in the debates around statues. I think it's entirely right that we've had a review of statues and place names and street names to understand who we're celebrating and why, because that tells us about what we value. And it's that whole thing where if you can't see it, you can't be it. Now, I don't have a problem with there being lots of white men who've done great things who are recognised, but it's also, you know, the Picton statue in Cardiff City Hall. Should that be there? It was right that the council had a proper debate about it. And I think trying to say, leave the past where it is and don't do anything about it is the wrong way to look at things. And I think you broadly have to make a choice. You say, keep them where they are, but explain who they really were. And deal with the fact that lots of people that we celebrate would have made money out of empire, would have made money out of slavery, would have actively traded in it. You know, Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, she had shares in John Hawkins' pirate expeditions. So it's been there as a feature for a long period of time. And I don't think it lessens who we are to acknowledge that's part of our history. Because actually, the fact that there was then an abolitionist movement, the fact that people in the Caribbean who were earning huge amounts of money for plantation owners, money that came back into the UK and helped to create wealth here again as well, I think that should be learnt and understood. And that understanding forms part of how people see themselves today. And it is that acceptance of who we are and who we have been that helps inform what today looks like, because there has undoubtedly been progress. And I've recently attended the unveiling of the Betty Campbell statue in the middle of Cardiff. And I knew Betty when she was alive. She was a real person. And I fought against her in a council election and I won by 2 votes. Now, that didn't mean that Betty saw me as a wonderful person all the time. You know, but that was a real person who mattered. And it doesn't matter that Betty and I didn't see eye to eye on every issue. She wasn't just the first black head teacher in Wales. She did that against a background of real struggle and people telling her she couldn't do it and she wasn't good enough. And she really mattered when most people that looked like me didn't. And we should celebrate that and recognise her story and what it tells us. And that, again, is about not saying that someone is perfect, saying, here's a real person, here's what we should learn from her life. And what do we do to make sure that people that are like her and me don't have to go through the same sort of struggle again today? And actually, what do we do to recognise that we're neighbours in a shared enterprise with a shared past, but also a shared future as well? And it's the future that we should be most concentrated on. And if you think about this in this way, about how much Wales has changed. When I was my son's age, he's 7, Glenn Webb was the only person that I saw playing rugby for Wales who looked like me. My father, as a white Welshman living in West England, would shout and scream at the television on International Day. His accent would change. He'd get very excited. I can't think really that you'd have an all-white Welsh rugby team taking the field today. That you'd have not just 15 players, but the 22, because they almost all play, and it wouldn't happen. And we wouldn't expect it to happen. We don't step back and say, positively, that is a marker of change and that is a good thing. We accept that that's who we are today. That's a reflection of it. The same with the Welsh football team, that we've been cheering on and celebrating their success, and not just their success on the pitch, but actually that the people who follow the Wales football team actually behave in a way that does credit to the country. And all of those different people from different backgrounds sharing something and believing that they're all in it together. And that when you see if Ben Cabango takes the pitch, he's a Wales player. And you wouldn't expect that Wales fans would react to him in the way that, again, when I was Isaac's age and people took bananas to football games to throw at players. You know, so there has been progress, but there's still challenge as well. And that's the part of the honesty in this, because if you look at statistics about criminal justice outcomes, if you look at statistics about educational outcomes and job outcomes, and what your surname is and how likely you are to get interviews and jobs and promoted, there are still challenges. But I am an optimistic person. And when I look at the future, I think that whilst my son is growing up in a world where there is deep division still, my son hasn't grown up seeing on the television news on a regular basis a country where white people oppress openly the black majority citizens in the way that South Africa was a feature of my childhood growing up. He'll see difference. He'll see people use offensive language. He'll see people with difficult attitudes, but he'll see more and more people that look like him and me continuing to play a part and continue to be really clear. I'm proud of my past and who I am, but I'm prouder still of my future. And my place in Wales is a part of our story to be celebrated and recognised. But let's not be complacent about the future. There will still be a need to think again about who we are and who we want to be. What sort of a Wales do we want to be? And in that context, the teaching of Welsh history in all of its context, the good, the bad and the indifferent, including black history within that, I think is a really welcome step forward to become a genuinely positive and outward looking country where citizens can really feel at ease with each other. And to remember, you can disagree without being disagreeable. And we can celebrate heroes regardless of what they look like. And equally, we can recognise that villains don't need to be abused because of the colour of their skin. There's definitely hope for the future. I'll leave it there, Vaughan, and I'll pass over to the other Vaughan, and I look forward to dealing with any questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And thank you as well, I think, for this, particularly at the end of that note of hope and not just an empty hope, a hope that the future is ours, but it's ours to make. And that's something that's very important for us in education, because one of the things that we are trying to do, of course, is to help form citizens of the future. And the role that we have to play as an institution in all the way that we do and how we demonstrate our equality and goodness as well is what helps inform the future. So thank you very much for that. You said so many interesting things there. I'll start with a question that's just come up, really. You talked about it's good that you've been the first in a number of things, but in another way, it's not good that you had to be the first in a number of things. And I suppose I get that. It's because we celebrate firsts, but in relation to where you've been first, like the first black president of the TUC or whatever, you know, it's why did you have to be the first? So have you experienced, you seem to be somebody who's broken through those ceilings. So where have you experienced in your career, perhaps particularly in Wales, the blockages for that? Where have you felt that you've had to fight to break through rather than being encouraged and welcomed?
I think that's one of the real challenges, because there's someone who works for me. He's a little older than I am. And in his life, people are just more overt, and they'd say you don't belong. And the difficulty of not being white was very much more in your face. When I've come through, part of the fights have been had on your behalf. So, you know, I wasn't the first black trade unionist who wanted to do something. But there were other people who chipped away at those barriers first. It doesn't mean they weren't talented enough to do things, but they didn't make it. But you stand on the shoulders of the progress been made before you. So actually, when I've been in the trade union movement and even here in politics, people haven't walked up to me and said, you don't belong here because you're black. People write that, and in particular on social media, you see an awful lot of filth thrown your way, but people don't behave in the same overt way that the National Front in the 70s and early 80s, and even the BNP in previous times did. So I've had people who've been broadly supportive of what I wanted to do and have encouraged me to do that as well. But the difficulty is that when you go about in your normal life, you know, I've definitely had these experiences, and so have my family members. You go into a shop and the staff follow you around, not because they're looking to see if they can help you to buy something, but because they're suspicious. My sister's had experience where she's gone into a shop and within
I think we've lost sound for a moment. I don't know whether there's a problem with the connection. I'll take the moment to say to John, the questions that you put in, thank you for putting the questions in. The questions you're putting in are coming up quite dark. I can just make them out, so we'll be okay, but just for you to be aware of that. We've got a problem with the connection for the Minister. I don't know whether we can chase that up, can we?
I'm not sure we can. It's I will try calling.
You're back. You're back. You're on mute now, Minister. You're on mute.
Sorry, I don't know quite what happened there and when things got interrupted, but yeah. I was trying to run through the fact that
you were talking about being followed in shops, not
yes,
to be helped, and that your sister had an experience.
That's true, and on more than one occasion of people asking, "Are you in the right place? Do you think you can afford anything here?" And that doesn't happen broadly to people that are white. And actually, Oprah Winfrey described the same thing, not that a while ago, but she was talking about the fact that someone said, "Are you sure you can afford to be here?" Now, Oprah Winfrey could probably go into the shop and buy everything in it. I've been in places where I've been where people assume I'm staff. So whether it's a restaurant and other places, and even walking in a suit or other stuff, you say that people are assuming that you work there, not that you're a customer. And so there's a challenge there about where people think you belong. And Dan Diath, who was the Lord Mayor of Cardiff a couple of years ago, he described going about his business as the Lord Mayor. And if he wasn't wearing his chain, people would assume that the white person who was his driver was the Lord Mayor, and he was either the driver or the security. So some of those attitudes are deeply ingrained about who you can be. And that's still part of our challenge to go through. But we do know that there is, and I think Brexit, regardless of how you voted, it unleashed people who felt it was okay to be overtly racist again. And that's part of the challenge about winning battles. Now, I don't think that the Brexit vote was one that was wholly founded on how people felt about difference. There were some people who voted in that way, but lots of people voted for very different reasons. And I don't want to get drawn into the idea that the Brexit vote was only a racist vote. It absolutely wasn't. But it did unleash people feeling they could be proud of being a racist again. And you've seen that in the way that there have been more complaints. More overt racism has taken place since then. So that's part of my point about needing to refight some of those battles and accept that things aren't perfect. And even with the way that some people responded to the Black Lives Matter movement, you've seen not just people saying all lives matter, don't say that I feel it's racist or Black Lives Matter, but the truth is that if you're black and you go in the criminal justice system, you're much more likely to have a worse outcome. And so there is something of understanding, yes, of course, all lives matter, but at the moment, if you're black, your prospects in life are lesser than a white counterpart with the same ability from the same background. And that's the point about recognizing if you don't want to recognize there's a difference that can't be justified, how do you expect to do something about it? So I'm proud of the people who came before me to help clear the way. And I want to do something to make sure that other people that are here now and will come later have better opportunities, because my view about life is that you shouldn't say, well, I've done it and I don't want other people to challenge what I've done. It's actually I want people to come behind to be better and to constantly raise the bar in achievement.
So I have to say, I don't think of myself often as naive in as a person, but hearing you say, about your sister and about being followed around in shops and people assuming that you're staff, I find a little, it takes my breath away, because I want to say, is that still happening? Because I find it amazing.
Well, not to me.
No, that's what I mean.
But in the last 2 years, people know who I am.
Yeah.
Actually, still, if you go back and if you had 100 black people in front of you and you ask them, have you ever had any of these experiences? I guarantee you'd find a number that would say, well, yes, that still happens. And you deal with it. It's part of the deal at the moment. It doesn't mean to say you like it, but there's a recognition that you're, and the difficulty with some of this is that you have some people saying, what do you mean you're looked at in a different way? You're just being overly sensitive. You're looking for it. And yet actually you see other people in shops that aren't followed and aren't helped and managed out in the same way. Other people don't turn up in a floral shirt to a restaurant and have people assume you must be the member of staff. And it was interesting when I was both dating my now wife, and even when we were married, I remember going out, I don't know, it must be 7 or 8 years ago. We went on a Valentine's meal, and we arrived, and there were people there who absolutely assumed that I was a member of staff, rather than I was there with my wife for a Valentine's meal in a nice place. And that really isn't that long ago.
I just find that very disturbing, really. But let me just ask you as well about something you touched on, because in your talk I was going to ask you about this, and you've just touched on it, which was the Brexit thing. And I understand that we're not going to say everybody who voted for Brexit is a racist, but I think there is a serious question. Do you think that the way in which we have managed our relationships with Europe have either made us as a country more racist, or it's made evident the racism that's always there, but that we fail to see?
I think it's mostly the latter, but I think when you embolden people to express views that are obnoxious, once they're there and they're publicly part of the discourse, you shouldn't be surprised if other people latch onto it and think, well, it's okay to think like that. And so there's a real challenge how the two are self-funding. Think about it in this way. I talked earlier about the Wales football team and about the fact that most of the fans are a real credit. The England football team did fantastically well in the Euros, and I actually wanted them to win. My son watched them, and his favourite player is Raheem Sterling. He loved him, and he was really good. But when you look at the people on the pitch and you look at the supporters that came and the way they behaved around the semi-final and the final, you had a team that deserved better supporters. Because you still see, and some of that is about how people are emboldened, and it's an extraordinary thing that all the stuff about booing players taking the knee, and if you have senior figures in public discourse saying that's acceptable to boo your own team, and not understand that actually those footballers, before they were very well paid athletes, most of them came from very normal backgrounds. Marcus Rashford isn't that atypical when it comes to being a professional footballer, because lots of those people get picked up and talent spotted, and they're not all people who come from a very advantaged background. So lots of the people in that football team and in professional football recognize that they've got a real opportunity that other people in the communities they grew up with didn't have. And Raheem Sterling's talked about his background as well, the fact that his mum did 2 or 3 jobs, and his teenage older sister helped to take him to training and gave up on her stuff to help give him an opportunity. So these are people that are really connected with the reality of what they faced as children, and the discrimination that they have seen and that they know is still out there. So you still have this really big challenge of what has Brexit done, and the way we talk about the rest of the world, and the way that we appear to other countries to be less welcoming. And that's a really big challenge, I think. You think about the university and education institutions. One of the big benefits that I found of going to university wasn't just getting a degree. It was actually you met lots of people from different backgrounds, from different parts of the world, and having that wider experience, I think, enriches you as a person as well. And if we go back and say we don't really want that within our country, it isn't just about the straight arguments about whether we'll create labour shortages. I think we'll create a position where we become more insular, and we allow discrimination to be tolerated to a point where it will affect who we are again in a way that I don't think we'd be proud of.
Yeah. The issue seems to be, every time we talk about it in our country, it seems to be white against black, as it were. Do you think that white people are more racist than people from other cultures?
I think you have to understand the context of where you are.
Okay.
Because if you think about Britain and Britain's past, there's been a past of, think about the words of Rule Britannia. Britons never, never shall be slaves. So there's a part of triumphalism there that still comes through. And if you think about different movements, think about Powell, a mainstream figure who was saying black people should be encouraged to leave because they don't belong here. So actually those sort of cultural norms are really difficult to feed out. And, I was talking earlier about outcomes in criminal justice or outcomes in employment and education. Sometimes it isn't that people are consciously deciding, I don't want black people to be here. And the difficulty about what's unconscious is that for some people, if you say you have unconscious bias, they always feel you're telling me I'm a racist. That's outrageous. I'm a good person. And so you've got this really big challenge. And again, think about sport and cricket, which is one of my favourite sports. And for a long time when I was growing up, the England cricket team was white, and it was unusual to have a black player. And yet now, you look through, and I think people are more aware of who plays county cricket, who plays international cricket, what does a country look like, where is the talent to come through. If we were having this conversation in Australia, you'd definitely be talking about black and white racism. If you were having this conversation in a South American country, it'd be much more complicated. So it isn't that white people are uniquely racist. It is a challenge and a problem that's part of the human condition, where you can see people who are different and you say they are different and I am better than you. And Britain has been, it's a majority white country. The history of Britain, its relationships with the rest of the world, and the cultural norms people have grown up with are part of what leads to some of that difference. And the Brexit conversation, and even the way that our current negotiations are working, you can see that some are very happy to say the problem isn't us, it's the foreigners. And that's a divisive way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Rather than there are people with competing economic interests, and this is difficult for everyone.
We've got loads of questions. I just want to get in if we can, and I'm conscious that you have to shoot off. So one of them comes from somebody in our group in the chat today, who's saying, will more funding be given to BAME support services? As a third sector service, we look to work in partnership but struggle to find agencies within the valleys.
Yeah, no, I think there's a real challenge, because when you look at the valleys, if you live in Cardiff, then you've got a larger group of diverse communities, and it's a more obvious fact and reality. Less so in the valleys, so the concentration of people is different, and it's more about what is a BAME support service and what do you look like and who do you want to partner with. Because I've just done an event this morning with Diverse Cymru, where they call it a cultural competence framework. They're basically helping businesses and public services to look at how they approach different people, both the staff, service users, customers, and public people that they're serving. And actually, that's about trying to understand who and how you work with those things. And I guess it's really about, if there was something about a more specific question about that person, I'm happy for that person to contact me afterwards and to try to see what can be done in terms of what they're looking to do and to achieve, and who the local stakeholders are. Because often it's about connecting people up in a way they didn't understand before. And actually, being successful in politics is a lot of that. Understand who do you need to know, what do you need to do, and how do you go about finding the right answer if you don't know it now. So, and equally, if there are more questions in the chat that we don't get through today, if you want to send them to me, then I'd happily respond back either in writing, or I might be able to record some answers to questions that people have if you want to post them online as well.
Okay, that's very kind of you. Thank you very much for that. I'm just watching the time. It's 1:45, and I know you have to go in 5 minutes. So this has got to be, I suppose, a question that you were probably, forgive me if it's one that you're predicting, but nevertheless, I think it's an important one that's come up here. What could universities do to promote greater diversity in Wales and combat racial stereotypes? And perhaps in asking you to address that, I could ask you to think about the situation of the University of South Wales, which has, 2 campuses, as it were, at the mouth of the valleys in Pontypridd and Glyntaf, and a campus in the centre of Cardiff, and of course one in Newport. So that mix that we've got of how we're doing it in a huge international multi-faith community in what is predominantly a Welsh Indigenous community.
Yeah, well, I think it's about understanding the context in which you're providing the education offer. And that's both about the physical locations where you are, but it's also about the community that you're living and working amongst. And that is both the university as an employer, as well as what the university does to look after and care for its students as well. Because again, if the university as an employer doesn't appear to be living its values and what it says it wants to do, then, you know, going out and recruiting international students, it looks like you want their money as opposed to anything else and the richness that they can provide to the learning experience. And I think that makes a difference again for learning as well, and understanding and having a makeup in your staff, because it's a big employer, the university, and to understand, are we still doing the right thing? Not to who gets through the door, but the points about, and where do they end up? Who's leading these different departments? That's important as well. And that honestly, it really makes a difference to students. And it's then, I think, about what you do in terms of working with students about expectations and conduct. It wasn't that long ago that there was a racially offensive play within Cardiff University in the medical students. And there was a challenge there about the fact that this had happened and the fact that black students didn't feel they could speak up and be listened to. And it took quite a lot to get there. The university did then act and investigate, but lots were bruised by the experience. And that expectation setting, the point about what do we expect from each other, I think that really matters. Yes, you want to be sensitive and understand there's difference, but equally you have to be able to say there are some things that are right and wrong. And you can't be part of the university community if you're prepared to behave in a way where you tell other people, I am prepared to say this, and if you get offended, it's your problem. And you need to accept that I'm entitled to say this about you and people that look like you, and it's only a joke. You know, again, going back to my childhood, when I was my son's age, there were loads of jokes where the black person was a bit of a joke, or where the Irishman was a butt of a joke. And although that stereotypical would say, well, would I put up with that now? Well, of course I wouldn't. But it was about understanding that just isn't funny. And it's not that I'm being overly sensitive about it. It's actually about, you know, what are you telling yourself about norms and how people should expect to be treated? And it is then the ability to have honest feedback with both staff and students about whether the university is managing to live its values. So when I was a lawyer and a partner, we had a staff survey, and it was important people were honest about the staff survey, and you take seriously the feedback you get, and importantly, not just to explain away when people are critical, but to understand why are people critical and is there more we need to do. And I would say this, wouldn't I, as a former student unionist, but working with the student union to understand how those things work as well, because sometimes people won't come to a university authority and say something, they'll want to go somewhere else, whether that's a student union or a trade union.
Yeah. And
being properly sensitive about those, and, you know, set yourself goals about where you want to be and what you want in terms of feedback from people that is honest, and whether actually you think that you as an employer will be able to honestly say we are an exemplary employer and people really do succeed based on their talent.
It's interesting because you mentioned in your talk earlier about the importance of curriculum and how that's changing and the work you've been doing with that. And I think so far as universities are concerned, one of the issues we have, of course, is we don't tend to have a core curriculum in that sense. But I think nevertheless, I think I should be saying that I know that at the University of Wales, I'm sure others too, but I know particularly about us that for a long while now, we are working on the decolonization of the curriculum that goes across all the strands of our teaching. And that's a very interesting but complex and difficult piece of work, you know. Nevertheless, there's a commitment to it. So I thought I'd just put that in there because it's another way in which the university can speak into this subject. One last thing very quickly before you go, if I can. What advice would you give to young black people in Wales today in dealing with these issues?
Don't be afraid to question whether things that are said to you and about you are right. Don't be afraid to ask people around you. And if you live in a situation where actually there isn't a big support network around you, you should still recognize that even if other people don't have the same experience as you, there are lots of good people around you who will want to help you, to understand and to support you. But don't ever feel that you're alone, because there are lots of us going through and have gone through similar experiences. And the final thing that I'd say is, as well as being honest about if you're facing challenge, it goes back to this message about hope and expectation. You know, you should have high ambitions for yourself. You should see yourself and be proud of who you are, and be proud to say part of my story may go to another part of the world, but my story is part of the story of Wales, and I'm part of my country's future. And I don't need someone to say I'm allowed to be here. This is my country too, and I want to be a part of making that future. And you know, I think that the attitude is important, to be positive, but that doesn't mean that there won't be times that are difficult.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that there won't be times you need support, but never be afraid to ask, because all of us, including me, need support and need friends and people to lean on, and that just makes you human.
Well, look, thank you very much. We're out of time. I need to keep faith with you because I know you've got to get away. So the first thing, let me say, thank you very much for taking the time. We realise you're busy. The other thing I want to say to you is we would like to be your friends. So if you think there's anything that you are doing that we could be supportive in that, you must call on us, because we would be willing to try and get behind you in those things. So thank you very much for that. We offer you that hand of friendship. Thank you for coming. I want to thank for others who've listened today and for all those who'll be picking it up on YouTube after. And if we do get lots of questions in, perhaps we could send them down in an email to you, if that's okay.
Happy to, yeah.
But thank you very much for taking time out of a busy day to be with us, and we wish you well for the rest of your Friday.
Thank you very much, Vaughan. Pleasure to see you.
Nice to see you, Vaughan. Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.